So recently I got a question from a student. How do you make the Lydian flat 7 scale sound interesting and not just like a scale? What can you do to make it more interesting? So I'm going to try to answer that, and I think the best example of that scale in music is the tune Blues 7 by Sonny Rollins. So we're going to take a look at that tune, and then hopefully I'll give you some ideas on how you can improve your Lydian flat 7 material. And then we're going to take a closer look also at this scale, and there's some interesting things about this scale. So let's go. Okay, so Blues 7 by Sonny Rollins is basically a blues in B flat. It's not a jazz blues or a bebop blues, just a blues. So B flat, you can go to E flat, B flat, E flat 7, and so on. So the first thing we need to know about the Lydian flat 7 scale is when we play it. So the Lydian flat 7 scale is just a Mixolydian scale, but with a raised fourth. It's also the fourth degree of F melodic minor. The B flat, Lydian flat 7 share the same notes as F melodic minor. So when you have a dominant chord that is going towards its tonic that wants to be resolved, there are a whole bunch of different dominant scales that you can choose from, and I've talked about that in previous videos. Also, depending on if you're in a minor or major key, right? So there's the altered scale, the what's it called, the symmetrical diminished scale, whole tone scale, the Phrygian dominant, and what have you. But the Lydian flat 7 scale you want to use when you have a dominant chord that is not a dominant. That might sound like a contradiction, but if you think about it, we're playing blues in B flat, right? This is not a dominant, technically. It's the tonic, right? We're in B flat. So that's when you want to use the Lydian flat 7 scale. I don't even think about these chords as functioning chords. It's just a blues. I think of each chord as its own mode. This is B flat Lydian flat 7. This is E flat Lydian flat 7. And the F Lydian flat 7. So it's like 3 different modes. Obviously the first choice would be the Mixolydian scale, but the problem with the Mixolydian scale is the 4th degree. So if we, instead of thinking of the scale as steps, but rather thirds, we get this problem here, right, with the flat 9 interval. That's why that note is an avoid note. It clashes with the chord, unless you rearrange the notes and make it a sus chord, which I've also talked about in previous lessons. So you can totally play a sus blues. That's a cool thing to do, but that's not what's happening here. This tune is very much about that sharp 11. So instead if we stack thirds from the Lydian flat 7 scale, that's the scale, right? But I'm not playing it. I'm playing it like this. We get the root, third, fifth, flat 7, 9, sharp 11, and 13. You could create this big fancy chords, right? It's basically a C triad over A flat and D, the guide tones. I find that those chords are a little bit too much often if you're comping. Those are more for kind of chord melody playing, but I digress. Okay, so I think, to answer the question that I got from a student, that one of the reasons that you're not playing anything interesting when you're trying to play the scale could be that you're not really hearing the scale properly. And also, you haven't necessarily listened to music where this scale is being used. In order to sound good in a certain style, for example, you need to know what that style of music sounds like, right? So listening to music where they use this scale is important. And again, this is the best example. But the first thing I want you to do is actually to take this melody and try to sing it. That might sound like an easy thing to do, but is it really? Let's try it. Da do da do do da do 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 da da do, right? So I'm not playing the chords, because if I play the chords, that will help me find the notes. I'm just playing the root like that, and what I'm trying to do is I want to make sure that I'm actually hitting that note. It's not that easy. If you find that easy, then that's great, then move on. But if you're having trouble with that, especially when you go to the F, that note is kind of weird if you're not used to this kind of sound. So if this was difficult for you to do, then I really recommend that you spend some time working on that, because one of the reasons that maybe you're not playing this scale in an interesting way is because you're not hearing it. This note is kind of weird, right? You often hear that in bebop and jazz in general, that they kind of land on that note. And I'm going to give you some examples after we worked on this tune. So then maybe just try to play the scale first and see what you can do. What you want to do is you want to find ways to kind of end your phrases on that funny note. Because sometimes when you hear that note, it's not necessarily Lydian flat 7. It could be just a chromatic kind of passing note, like if you're playing that. So maybe there it's just kind of a passing note. Doesn't mean that you have to be derived from the Lydian flat 7. Or sometimes it might be this kind of thing. The line cliche kind of thing. But in this tune, it's clear to me that it's really about this scale. Maybe Sonny Rollins is not thinking of it like that scale. Maybe he's just thinking of that note as some kind of tritone or something. But it's pretty obvious that he's kind of experimenting and exploring this sound. That's why we should listen to the solo and ideally learn the solo. So here's the solo. Okay, so I don't want to play too much for copyright reasons, but there's some really interesting ideas here. Already there, you can hear that he's emphasizing that note, and he's kind of doing that all the time. So taking some ideas from that and listening to it, learning how to kind of get used to that note is the first step. Then some things you can do, obviously, is stuff that I've covered before in my videos, such as hexatonics or triad pairs. So you could take a B flat triad and a C augmented. And there's a whole bunch of different patterns that you can use, right? So if you're interested in that stuff, I recommend these books. Hexatonics by Jerry Bergonzi. See how thick that is? That's filled with hexatonic patterns, or triad pairs for jazz. Those are two great books if you're interested in that. So I'm gonna demonstrate how to use hexatonics over this tune, and so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna play the triad of the chord, so B flat, and then go up a step and do a augmented triad, and then the same thing for all the chords. So here we go. Okay, so triad pairs is a good thing you can do, and if you're interested in that, you can also check out my previous videos on triad pairs. I'll link to those videos in the description below. Then pentatonics, it's kind of problematic because if you play a B flat major pentatonic, you don't get the flat 7. If you play a major pentatonic with a flat 7, you don't get the sharp 11, and those are the notes that you kind of want, because those are the note that defines this scale, so, or this sound. So one scale that you can use is the go up a step and play a major scale, but lower the sixth. So a C major flat 6 pentatonic. I've also covered this kind of stuff in previous videos. So I'll do that. I'll go up a step from each of the chords and play a major pentatonic with a flat 6. Okay, so I'm not super big on those kind of pentatonics. If you're interested in that stuff, I recommend this book that I've also recommended before, the Pentatonics by Jerry Bergonzi, Volume 2. All right, so there are a couple of things you need to understand about this sound. The first thing was that it's used when a dominant chord is not kind of the 5 of its tonic, But when it's more of like, let's say you have a static dominant chord. The next thing you need to understand about this scale is that there's a difference between the sharp 11 when it's an extension, a chord extension, as opposed to when it's a chromatic leading note or a chromatic passing note or something. So when you think of that note as an extension, that means that it doesn't want to resolve. That's what I mean by it's important to listen to Sonny Rollins when he kind of goes, and that note just kind of sits there. Whereas traditionally that note would have been a dissonant. Well, it is a dissonant, but people would have resolved it. So let me give you a good example of when a sharp 11 on a dominant chord is not an extension, but rather a leading note. So let me give you a good example of that. So that was Mozart, right? He does this all the time. So that is a sharp 11. But it resolves to the fifth. So it's not a chord extension. It's just a chromatic, I'm not sure of the correct technical term, a leading note, a chromatic, it's not a passing note. It's been so long since I studied that kind of stuff, so I don't remember. Maybe some of you know the exact correct term. Something called appoggiatura. I'm not sure if that's what it is. But, so imagine if I just played. But that's what happens in jazz, right? I guess it kind of resolves there, but you could stay on that note. Right? Or so it's important to understand that difference. Why? Because, well, first of all, if you're writing for a big band and you have that note in the melody and you want to voice it out, of course it's going to be completely different depending on which, if you look at it as an extension or if it's a chromatic note, right? It's also important to know for if you're comping, right? Because if that note is going to resolve, you don't want to play a flat 7 voicing because that's going to clash when it resolves, right? That's why it's kind of good to avoid the fifth altogether in jazz when you're comping. But more than anything, it's about getting used to that note so that it can kind of pop up in your head when you're playing and you can hear it. Because chances are, if they you think your Lydian flat 7 playing is boring, it's because you're not hearing that sound. So another really funny example of this problem is the tune Dave Brubeck's tune "In Your Own Sweet Way." That's what most people play there. But that's Miles Davis's version. He changed it. That's not what's in the original recording. But Miles's version is so famous that most people play like that. And I've heard, so don't quote me on this, I'm not sure if it's true, but I've heard that Dave Brubeck heard Miles' version, obviously, and he didn't like it because that's not what he intended. But there, Miles Davis lets that note just sit there, it doesn't resolve it. Right? So it's just an interesting side note. So let's take a closer look at this scale, because I think it's important that when you learn a new thing, a new concept or a new scale, that you understand the history and where it's kind of coming from and how it has been used in the past and by other composers or what have you. So that will help you kind of create an understanding of the scale, and also it makes it come alive so that it's just not something that you see on a page in a book. You want to bring some life into theory and put it into practice. So it's actually pretty interesting. This scale is also called the acoustic scale or the overtone scale. I should also mention that some people call it the Lydian sharp 11 scale. But the reason it's called the overtone scale is because it's kind of a scale that you can create from the overtone series. So I'm not an expert at this at all, but you can kind of hear it. If I play E, then the overtones, if I try to hit those, that's the flat 7, right? Here somewhere is that sharp 11. So when you hear traditional old like world music, especially it's called Tivan music from Siberia, where they do that throat singing where there's a lot of overtones. But even in Swedish folk music, there are certain instruments that have a lot of overtones. You can kind of hear that sound. So you can hear that scale. It can be kind of a more of a exotic world music type sound too, which can be interesting to explore. So Siberian music is also used in classical music. Scriabin has this piece called A Poem for Prometheus or something like that, where he plays this chord, or he uses this sound. So it's called the Prometheus Court or the Mystic Chord. Okay, so that was Lydian Flat 7. I hope you got something out of it, and as always, you'll find PDFs on my Patreon page. And by the way, I've reached my goal on Patreon, so thank you so much. I'll try to make some bonus videos for you guys. I have some, I just haven't had time to edit them. But yeah, thanks for watching. I shall see you next time.